The dusty pickup truck pulled up to the weathered fence post where a handwritten sign swayed in the Montana breeze. Serious inquiries only. See Martha Caldwell at the main house. Below it, in smaller letters that had faded from years of sun and rain, were the words that had drawn curious glances from passersby for months. Marriage proposal, land included. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would change 3 lives forever, but not in the way anyone expected. The Caldwell Ranch stretched across 4,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, its boundaries marked by ancient oak trees and stone walls built by hands that had been dust for generations. Martha Caldwell stood on her wraparound porch, her weathered fingers gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the sun paint the rolling hills in shades of amber and gold. At 63, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades fighting both the land and life itself, winning some battles and losing others in ways that carved deep lines around her gray eyes. The ranch house behind her told stories of better times, fresh paint that had once been white, now faded to the color of old bones, shutters that hung slightly askew from springs when the wind had been particularly cruel. The barn in the distance leaned like an old man tired of standing, its red paint peeling in long strips that fluttered like ribbons in the constant Montana breeze. This was the Caldwell legacy, 4 generations of sweat and dreams soaked into soil that had grown everything from wheat to cattle to heartbreak. Inside the house, Eleanor Caldwell sat at the kitchen table, her substantial frame filling the antique chair that had belonged to her great-grandmother. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that people noticed when they looked past first impressions, intelligent brown eyes that seemed to catalog every slight and kindness, thick auburn hair that caught light like copper wire, and hands that moved with surprising grace whether she was kneading bread or sketching the wildflowers that grew wild along the creek bed. But in a world that measured worth by waist sizes and wedding rings, Eleanor had learned to make herself invisible, to speak softly and expect little. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window caught the dust motes dancing above the table where Eleanor had spread out the ranch's financial records. Numbers don't lie, and these numbers painted a picture bleaker than a Montana winter. The drought had lasted 3 years, turning fertile pastures into cracked earth that crunched underfoot like broken promises. Cattle prices had plummeted while feed costs soared, creating a perfect storm that had decimated smaller ranches throughout the county. The Caldwell Ranch, once profitable enough to support 3 families, now bled money faster than a stuck pig. Martha had spent the previous night pacing the floor of her bedroom, her bare feet wearing a path in the hardwood as she wrestled with a decision that would either save or destroy what remained of her family's legacy. The bank had been patient, but patience was a luxury that institutions couldn't afford indefinitely. The final notice sat on her nightstand like a death sentence, 90 days to settle the debt or face foreclosure. "Eleanor, honey," Martha called from the doorway, her voice carrying the weight of sleepless nights and impossible choices. "We need to talk." Eleanor looked up from the ledger where she'd been trying to find money that simply wasn't there. Her mother's tone carried a finality that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She'd heard that tone before, when Martha had announced they were selling the horses, when they'd let go of the last hired hand, when they'd closed off the north wing of the house to save on heating costs. "I've been thinking about our situation," Martha continued, settling into the chair across from her daughter. "And I've come to a decision that you're not going to like." Eleanor set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap, a gesture of preparation that she'd perfected over years of receiving news that ranged from disappointing to devastating. "What kind of decision?" Martha reached across the table and took her daughter's hands, noticing how soft they still were despite years of ranch work. Eleanor had always been gentle with everything she touched, from wounded animals to fragile feelings. A trait that Martha both admired and worried would be her downfall in a world that rewarded toughness over tenderness. "I'm going to put up a notice," Martha said, her words coming out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. "A marriage proposal. The ranch goes to whoever marries you." The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second marking time in a conversation that would divide her life into before and after. She stared at their joined hands, noting how her mother's fingers trembled slightly, a sign of the Parkinson's that Martha refused to acknowledge or treat. "You can't be serious," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. "I'm dead serious," Martha replied, her grip tightening. "This ranch has been in our family for over a century. Your great-great-grandfather built the original cabin with his bare hands, cleared the land tree by tree, stone by stone. Your grandfather expanded it, built the barn, dug the wells. Your father modernized the operation, brought in new breeds of cattle, improved the irrigation systems. 4 generations of Caldwells have poured their lives into this land, and I'll be damned if I'm the one who lets it slip away to some bank in Billings." Eleanor pulled her hands free and stood, moving to the window where she could see the expanse of land that had been both her prison and her paradise. Every acre held memories: the creek where she'd caught her first trout, the meadow where she'd learned to ride, the old oak tree where she'd carved her initials next to a boy's name that she'd later scratched out with a pocket knife when he'd told his friends that kissing fat Eleanor Caldwell was like hugging a pillow. "And what about what I want?" Eleanor asked, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. "What if I don't want to marry a stranger just to save the ranch?" Martha's chair creaked as she shifted, and Eleanor could see her mother's reflection joining hers in the window. "What do you want, Eleanor? Really want?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. What did she want? She wanted to wake up in the morning without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on her chest. She wanted to walk into a room without automatically calculating where the exits were, without scanning faces for signs of disgust or pity. She wanted to be seen as more than a cautionary tale, more than a charity case, more than the fat daughter who'd failed to find a husband despite her mother's increasingly desperate attempts at matchmaking. "I want to matter," Eleanor said finally, her voice so quiet that Martha had to strain to hear it. "I want to be chosen because someone sees value in me, not because they're getting 4,000 acres as a bonus." Martha stood and moved to stand beside her daughter, their reflections now side by side in the window. "You do matter, Eleanor. You matter more than this ranch, more than the money, more than anything else in this world. But sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the people we love. So I'm the sacrifice." "You're the solution," Martha corrected, her voice gaining strength. "You're smart, you're capable, you know this land better than anyone. Whoever marries you won't just be getting a wife, they'll be getting a partner who can help them build something lasting." Eleanor turned to face her mother, searching those gray eyes for signs of doubt or deception. All she found was the same iron determination that had carried Martha through a difficult marriage, single motherhood, and now this impossible situation. "What if no one responds to the notice?" Eleanor asked. "What if the only men who show up are desperate or cruel or looking for a way to get rich quick?" "Then we'll figure out another way," Martha said, though they both knew there was no other way. The ranch was their last asset, their only bargaining chip in a game where the house always won. Eleanor walked to the kitchen table and picked up the pen she'd been using to reconcile accounts that couldn't be reconciled. She began to write, her handwriting neat and precise despite the tremor in her hands. "What are you doing?" Martha asked. "Writing the notice," Eleanor replied without looking up. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. No false advertising, no unrealistic expectations, just the truth." Martha watched as her daughter wrote, each word a small rebellion against the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. The notice was direct and honest, stating the terms clearly without embellishment or apology. 4,000 acres of prime Montana ranch land, a house that needed work but had good bones, and a woman who came with both. Ranch seeking partnership. Eleanor wrote at the top, serious inquiries only. Marriage required, land included. She signed her name at the bottom with a flourish that surprised them both, then handed the paper to her mother. Martha read it twice, noting the careful way Eleanor had framed the arrangement as a partnership rather than a transaction, the way she'd emphasized the land's potential rather than its current struggles. "This is good," Martha said finally. "This is honest. It's desperate," Eleanor corrected. "But it's honest desperation." Martha folded the notice and tucked it into her shirt pocket. "I'll drive into town tomorrow and post it at the general store, maybe put one up at the diner too. Word will spread fast in a place like Millfield." Millfield, Montana, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip traveled faster than wildfire and lasted longer than most marriages. The population sign at the town limits proudly proclaimed 1,247 residents, though that number fluctuated with the seasons as ranch hands came and went with the work. It was a place where people were born, lived, and died within a 20-mile radius, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual county fair or the occasional bar fight at Murphy's Tavern. Eleanor nodded, already imagining the conversations that would spring up around kitchen tables and in checkout lines. "The Caldwell girl," they'd whisper, finally getting desperate enough to advertise for a husband. "Poor thing," they'd say, shaking their heads with the kind of pity that felt more like judgment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I need some air," Eleanor said, moving toward the back door. "I'll be at the creek if you need me." Martha watched her daughter leave, noting the way Eleanor's shoulders straightened as she walked away from the house, as if she were shedding a burden with each step. The creek had always been Eleanor's refuge, the place where she went to think and dream and sometimes cry where no one could see her tears. The walk to the creek took Eleanor through the heart of the ranch, past the empty pastures where cattle used to graze, past the equipment shed filled with machinery that would soon belong to someone else. The creek ran year-round, fed by springs that had never failed even in the worst droughts, and Eleanor had often thought it was the most honest thing about the property: clear, constant, and impossible to corrupt. She settled on the flat rock that had served as her thinking spot since childhood, her feet dangling in water that was cold enough to make her gasp. The current carried away leaves and twigs, and occasionally her tears, asking no questions and making no judgments. Here, she could be herself without apology or explanation. Eleanor pulled out her phone and scrolled through social media, looking at pictures of former classmates who'd married young and were now posting photos of children and anniversary dinners and family vacations. She'd stopped attending high school reunions years ago, tired of the pitying looks and the well-meaning but cutting comments about how she'd find someone someday or how she was such a good catch for the right man. Eleanor had stopped believing in that particular fairy tale around the time she'd realized that men looked through her rather than at her, that she existed in a category somewhere between invisible and undesirable. She'd had exactly 3 dates in her adult life, all arranged by well-meaning friends who'd promised that he has a great personality, or he's really funny once you get to know him. Each date had ended the same way, with polite conversation, awkward silences, and the inevitable text message the next day explaining that while she was really sweet, they just didn't feel a romantic connection. Now her mother was essentially putting her up for auction, and Eleanor wasn't sure which was worse: humiliation of being advertised like livestock, or the terrifying possibility that someone might actually respond to the notice. What kind Of man would be desperate enough to marry a stranger for land? What kind of life would that be? Built on a foundation of mutual desperation, rather than love or even basic compatibility. The sun was setting by the time Eleanor made her way back to the house, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that would have been beautiful if she'd been in the mood to appreciate beauty. The kitchen was empty, but she could hear the television in the living room where her mother was watching the evening news, a ritual that had become increasingly depressing as the anchors reported on economic downturns and climate change and all the other forces that were conspiring to make life harder for people like them. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, a space that had remained largely unchanged since her teenage years. The walls were still painted the soft blue she'd chosen at 15, decorated with ribbons from county fair competitions and photographs of horses and landscapes that she'd taken with an old camera her father had given her for Christmas. Bookshelf held a mixture of romance novels and agricultural journals, a combination that seemed to sum up the contradiction of her life. A woman who believed in love, but had learned to be practical about survival. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop, staring at the blank document on the screen. If she was going to do this, if she was going to potentially spend the rest of her life with a stranger, she wanted to at least try to find someone who might understand her. She began to type, creating a more detailed description of herself and what she was looking for, something that could be shared with serious inquiries. "My name is Eleanor Caldwell," she wrote. "I'm 28 years old, and I've lived on this ranch my entire life. I know every acre, every season, every challenge that comes with this land. I'm not looking for a fairy tale or a rescue. I'm looking for a partner who understands that some of the best things in life require work, patience, and commitment." She paused, considering how honest to be about her appearance, about the realities of her situation. In the end, she decided that honesty was the only foundation on which any relationship could be built, even one that began with such unusual circumstances. "I'm not what most people would consider conventionally attractive," she continued. "I'm overweight, I'm shy in social situations, and I have strong opinions about everything from cattle breeding to classical music. I read too much, I worry too much, and I have a tendency to care more about animals than people. But I'm also loyal, hardworking, and capable of loving deeply when someone gives me the chance." Eleanor read over what she'd written, making small changes and corrections until she was satisfied that it represented her truthfully. She saved the document and closed the laptop, then prepared for bed with the strange feeling that she was ending one chapter of her life and beginning another. Down the hall, Martha lay awake in her own bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The notice sat on her nightstand, folded and ready to be posted the next morning. She'd raised Eleanor to be independent and strong, to never settle for less than she deserved. Now she was asking her daughter to marry a stranger to save a piece of land that might not even be worth saving. But as Martha listened to the sounds of the old house settling around her, the creaking boards, the whistling wind, the distant lowing of the few cattle they still owned, she knew that this ranch was more than just property. It was identity, it was history. It was the only thing standing between the Caldwell name and complete obscurity. Tomorrow she would drive into town and post the notice, and whatever happened after that would be in the hands of fate and the kindness of strangers. Neither woman slept well that night, both understanding that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The general store in Millfield served as the unofficial headquarters of local gossip. Its bulletin board, a collection of handwritten notices for everything from lost cats to used farm equipment. Martha Caldwell stood before this board at 7 in the morning, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the thumbtacks. The store was empty except for old Pete Morrison, who was selecting his daily lottery ticket with the concentration of a surgeon. Martha had rewritten the notice 3 times before settling on the final version, each draft either too desperate or too vague. The paper felt heavier than it should as she positioned it prominently in the center of the board, covering a faded advertisement for a church bake sale from 2 months ago. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said, abandoning his lottery tickets to peer over Martha's shoulder. "That's quite a proposition you got there, Martha." Word spread through Millfield with the efficiency of a wildfire. By noon, the notice had been photographed and shared across social media platforms, drawing comments from as far away as California and Florida. The local diner buzzed with speculation over coffee and pie, while the hardware store became a gathering place for men who claimed they were just curious about the arrangement. 200 miles away in Billings, Thomas Mitchell sat in his cramped studio apartment, scrolling through social media during his lunch break from the construction site, where he spent his days pouring concrete and trying not to think about the life he'd lost. At 35, Thomas carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to absorb disappointment without letting it break him completely. His marriage had ended 18 months earlier when his wife decided that a concrete worker with calloused hands and simple dreams wasn't the future she'd envisioned for herself. The divorce had taken everything: the house, the savings, even the dog. Thomas had moved to Billings because it was far enough from his hometown to avoid the pitying looks and whispered conversations about poor Tom Mitchell and his cheating wife. He worked construction during the day and took online courses at night, slowly building toward a business degree that might eventually lead to something better than mixing cement and dodging judgment. The ranch proposal appeared on his feed through a friend's share, accompanied by a comment about desperate times calling for desperate measures. Thomas almost scrolled past it, but something about the straightforward language caught his attention. This wasn't some elaborate scheme or get-rich-quick fantasy. It was two women facing reality with the kind of honesty that had become increasingly rare in his experience. He read the notice 3 times, then clicked on the link to a more detailed description that someone had posted in the comments. Eleanor Caldwell's words struck him as authentic in a way that felt almost foreign after years of online dating. Profiles filled with filtered photos and carefully curated achievements. Here was someone admitting to flaws, acknowledging struggles, asking for partnership rather than rescue. Thomas had grown up on his grandmother's small farm in eastern Montana before she'd sold it to pay for medical bills. He understood the weight of generational land, the way certain places could hold a family's entire history in their soil. He also understood the economics of modern agriculture, the impossible mathematics that turned family operations into corporate acquisitions. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, attempting to write a response. His first draft sounded too eager, his second too casual. By the third attempt, he decided to match Eleanor's honesty with his own. Meanwhile, in Millfield, Eleanor had discovered that being the subject of widespread speculation was even worse than being invisible. She'd made the mistake of going to the grocery store that afternoon, where every conversation stopped when she entered and resumed in hushed whispers as she passed. The checkout clerk, a girl named Sarah who'd graduated 3 years behind Eleanor, couldn't make eye contact while scanning items. "People are talking," Eleanor told her mother that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The whole town thinks we've lost our minds." "People always talk," Martha replied, rocking gently in the chair that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. "The question is whether any of them are willing to do more than talk." They had received exactly 7 phone calls since the notice went up. 3 were from reporters wanting to do human interest stories about the unusual matrimonial arrangement. 2 were from men who sounded drunk and made suggestions that had nothing to do with marriage or ranching. 1 was from Eleanor's cousin in Denver, calling to ask if the rumors were true and to offer financial help that they all knew wasn't substantial enough to matter. The 7th call had been different. A man named Robert Henley from Great Falls had spoken to Martha for nearly an hour, asking detailed questions about the ranch's water rights, soil composition, and current livestock situation. He'd seemed knowledgeable and serious, but there had been something calculating in his voice that made Martha uncomfortable. He'd ended the conversation by asking for financial records and a complete survey of the property. He sounded like he was buying a business, Martha told Eleanor. Which I suppose he is in a way, but it still felt wrong. Eleanor had listened to her mother's account of the conversation with growing unease. She'd spent her entire life on the ranch, and the idea of handing it over to someone who saw it purely as an investment felt like a betrayal of everything her family had built. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Eleanor found an envelope that had been slipped under the front door sometime during the night, her name written across the front in careful handwriting. Inside was a handwritten letter on plain white paper, no return address, no signature at the bottom. "Dear Eleanor," it began. "I saw the notice about your ranch and read your description of yourself and what you're looking for. I want you to know that what struck me most wasn't the land or the financial arrangement, but your honesty about who you are and what you need. I've been thinking about whether I have the right to respond to something like this, whether I'm the kind of man who could be a real partner to someone like you." Eleanor read the letter twice before continuing to the second paragraph. "I'm not rich, and I'm not particularly handsome. I'm a construction worker who's trying to build something better for himself. I grew up on a farm, and I understand the weight of land that's been in a family for generations. I also understand what it means to lose everything and have to start over." The letter went on to describe a man who seemed to exist in the same space between dreams and reality that Eleanor inhabited. He wrote about his failed marriage, his financial struggles, his longing for something permanent in a world that seemed increasingly temporary. Most importantly, he wrote about Eleanor herself, referencing specific details from her description that suggested he'd read it carefully rather than simply responding to the promise of free land. "I don't know if this is crazy or if it's the sanest thing either of us could do," the letter concluded. "But I'd like to meet you, not as a business transaction, but as two people who might be able to build something together. If you're interested, I'll be at Murphy's Tavern on Saturday at 7 p.m. I'll be wearing a blue shirt and reading a book about sustainable agriculture. If you decide not to come, I'll understand completely." Eleanor found herself reading the letter a third time, searching for red flags or signs of deception. The handwriting was neat but not perfect, suggesting someone who'd taken time with the words, but wasn't trying to impress her with calligraphy. The tone was respectful without being overly formal, confident without being arrogant. She carried the letter to the kitchen where Martha was preparing breakfast, sliding it across the table without comment. Martha read it while stirring scrambled eggs, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Well," Martha said finally, "this is different from the others." "Different how?" "He's writing to you, not to me. He's asking to meet you, not inspect the property. And he signed it, hopefully Thomas Mitchell, instead of demanding your phone number or financial information." Eleanor took the letter back, noting details she'd missed on her first readings. The way he'd written "someone like you" without any of the qualifying language she'd come to expect. The way he'd acknowledged the unusual nature of their situation without treating it as a joke or an opportunity to exploit. "Saturday is tomorrow," Eleanor said. "It is. Murphy's Tavern is going to be packed on Saturday night. Half the town will be there, probably." Eleanor folded the letter and tucked it into her shirt pocket. What if he's not what I expect? What if he takes one look at me and changes his mind? Martha turned off the stove and faced her daughter. "Then he's not the right person, and you'll have saved yourself from making a mistake. But what if he is what you expect? What if he looks at you and sees exactly what he hoped to find?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that Eleanor had taught herself not to consider. She'd spent so many years preparing for disappointment, that the prospect of actual hope felt dangerous. That afternoon, Eleanor drove into town to run errands that she'd been putting off for weeks. At the bank, she endured sympathetic looks from tellers who'd undoubtedly heard about the marriage proposal. At the feed store, she overheard two ranchers discussing whether that Caldwell girl would actually go through with marrying a stranger. Final stop was the small dress shop on Main Street, a place she rarely visited because the selection in her size was limited and the owner, Mrs. Peterson, had a talent for making even the most innocent shopping trip feel like a judgment of character. Eleanor needed something to wear to Murphy's Tavern, something that would make her feel confident without looking like she was trying to. Mrs. Peterson was arranging a display of summer dresses when Eleanor entered, her face immediately shifting into the expression of someone confronting an unexpected challenge. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Peterson said with false brightness, "what brings you in today?" "I need a dress," Eleanor replied simply, refusing to elaborate on the occasion. Mrs. Peterson led her to a small section in the back of the store, where a handful of dresses in larger sizes hung like afterthoughts. Eleanor flipped through them without enthusiasm, finding nothing that didn't look like it was designed for someone's grandmother or someone heading to a funeral. "Are you looking for anything specific?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her tone suggesting that Eleanor's options were inherently limited. "Something that makes me look like myself," Eleanor said, surprising them both with the honesty of the response. Mrs. Peterson paused in her hovering, actually looking at Eleanor for the first time instead of focusing on her size. "What does that mean to you?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "It means I want to look like someone who knows her own worth, who doesn't apologize for taking up space, who isn't hiding from anything." Something shifted in Mrs. Peterson's expression, and she moved to a different part of the store, returning with a dress that Eleanor hadn't seen before. It was a deep forest green, simply cut but well-tailored, with three-quarter sleeves that would cover Eleanor's arms without making her feel like she was hiding. "This came in yesterday," Mrs. Peterson said. "I ordered it for someone else, but it might work for you." Eleanor took the dress to the fitting room, expecting the usual disappointment of clothes that didn't quite fit or flattering that emphasized all the wrong things. Instead, she found herself looking at a woman who appeared comfortable in her own skin, confident without being defiant, attractive in a way that had nothing to do with conforming to other people's standards. She bought the dress without trying to negotiate the price, then stopped at the drugstore for makeup she rarely wore and perfume she'd never tried. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it as herself, but the best version of herself she could manage. Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of night that made people want to sit on porches and believe that summer might actually come to stay. Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the green dress for the 100th time, applying lip gloss with hands that shook slightly despite her efforts to appear calm. Murphy's Tavern occupied a corner building that had housed everything from a hardware store to a barber shop over its 100-year history. The current incarnation featured dark wood paneling, neon beer signs, and a jukebox that played everything from classic country to modern rock. On Saturday nights, it attracted everyone from ranch hands celebrating payday to couples on dates, to groups of friends avoiding the responsibilities of real life. Eleanor arrived at 7:15. Late enough to suggest she wasn't desperate, but not so late as to seem rude. The parking lot was nearly full, confirming her prediction that half the town would be there to witness whatever was about to unfold. She paused at the entrance, her hand on the door handle, giving herself one last chance to change her mind. Through the window, she could see the usual Saturday night crowd, but also several faces that turned toward the door with obvious curiosity. This was it, the moment where she either stepped forward into possibility or retreated into the safety of expectations. Eleanor pushed open the door and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for a man in a blue shirt reading a book about sustainable agriculture. The tavern was louder than she'd expected, filled with conversation and laughter, and the click of pool balls from the back room. She moved through the crowd, noting the way conversations paused as she passed, the way people tried to look without appearing to stare. And then she saw him, Thomas. Mitchell sat in the corner booth of Murphy's Tavern. A paperback copy of Rotational Grazing for Sustainable Ranching open on the table before him, though he hadn't turned a page in the last 20 minutes. His blue chambray shirt was crisp, but not new, chosen because it brought out his eyes without looking like he was trying too hard. At 35, he had the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work, sunlines around brown eyes, strong hands that bore the permanent stains of honest labor, and graying temples that suggested reliability rather than age. He'd arrived at Murphy's 30 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly because he wanted to observe the dynamics of the room before Eleanor arrived. The tavern hummed with the energy of a small town on Saturday night, but Thomas could sense the undercurrent of anticipation that had nothing to do with the band setting up in the corner or the pool tournament getting underway in the back room. Eleanor Caldwell was news in Millfield, and Thomas had quickly realized that their meeting would be a public event whether they wanted it or not. He'd counted at least 6 people who'd glanced his way with obvious curiosity, and he suspected that half the room was waiting to see what would unfold between the stranger in the corner and the woman whose marriage proposal had become local legend. When Eleanor walked through the door, Thomas felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room. Conversations didn't stop, but they changed, becoming more conscious of themselves, more performative. Eleanor moved through the crowd with a grace that surprised him, her forest green dress simple but striking, her auburn hair catching the light from the neon signs. She was larger than the women he'd typically dated, but there was something about the way she carried herself that spoke of intelligence and strength. Their eyes met across the room, and Thomas raised his hand slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than greeting. Eleanor navigated between tables and conversations, pausing twice to nod at people she recognized, her composure never wavering despite what Thomas suspected was considerable internal turmoil. "You must be Thomas," she said when she reached his table, her voice carrying the slight huskiness that often came with nervousness. "And you're Eleanor," he replied, standing and extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Her handshake was firm, and she looked directly into his eyes rather than glancing away, as many people did upon first meeting someone new. Thomas noted the intelligence in her brown eyes, the way she seemed to be cataloging details about him, just as he was doing with her. "I almost didn't," Eleanor admitted as they settled into the booth across from each other. "This whole situation is so far outside my normal experience that I'm not sure I know how to navigate it." The waitress approached their table with the efficiency of someone who'd been working Saturday nights at Murphy's for longer than she cared to remember. Her name tag read Cindy, and her smile was professional but curious. "What can I get you folks?" Cindy asked, her tone suggesting she was perfectly aware of who they were and why they were there. Thomas ordered a beer. Eleanor asked for a glass of wine, and they both requested menus despite neither feeling particularly hungry. The ordering process gave them a moment to observe each other without the pressure of immediate conversation, and Thomas found himself studying Eleanor's face for signs of disappointment or regret. Instead, he saw curiosity and perhaps a carefully guarded hope. Eleanor possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself gradually, high cheekbones that became more pronounced when she smiled, expressive eyes that seemed to change color depending on the light, and a mouth that suggested both gentleness and determination. "So," Eleanor said once Cindy had departed, "sustainable agriculture. Are you researching for a specific reason, or do you just enjoy reading about crop rotation on Saturday nights?" Thomas laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "I grew up on my grandmother's farm, and I've been thinking about getting back into agriculture someday." The book is research, but also a way to remember what I loved about farming before I got distracted by other things. What kind of other things? Marriage, for one. City life. The idea that success meant moving away from the land instead of working with it. Thomas paused, considering how much to reveal about his past. My ex-wife thought farming was backward, that I should focus on careers that didn't involve dirt. Under my fingernails, Eleanor nodded slowly. I've heard that before. People seem to think that working the land is somehow less valuable than working in an office, even though agriculture feeds everyone and sustains communities. Exactly. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Your letter mentioned that you know every acre of your ranch. What's your favorite part of the property? The question caught Eleanor off guard, partly because it focused on her knowledge rather than her appearance or her desperation, and partly because no one had asked her about the ranch in terms of personal preference rather than financial value. The creek that runs along the eastern boundary, she said without hesitation. It's fed by springs that never dry up, even in drought years. There's a bend where the water has carved out a swimming hole, and the cottonwoods create this natural canopy. It's where I go when I need to think or when the world feels too complicated. That sounds like the kind of place every good ranch needs, Thomas said. A sanctuary. What about you? If you had a ranch, what would be your priority? Thomas considered the question carefully. Water first, obviously, then soil health. You can't build anything sustainable without taking care of the foundation. But after that, I think I'd want to create something that could support multiple generations, not just turn a quick profit. Their drinks arrived, providing another natural pause in the conversation. Eleanor sipped her wine and realized that she was actually enjoying herself, despite the unusual circumstances and the obvious attention they were receiving from other patrons. Thomas seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than simply trying to charm his way toward a business arrangement. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said, setting down her wine glass. What made you respond to the notice? Really? Thomas was quiet for a moment, rolling his beer between his palms. Honestly, I've been living in a studio apartment in Billings for 18 months, working construction and taking online classes, trying to figure out what comes next. When I saw your notice, it wasn't the land that caught my attention. It was the way you wrote about partnership, about building something together instead of one person rescuing the other. And you're not concerned about marrying someone you don't know? Of course I'm concerned, Thomas admitted. But I'm also tired of dating people who want me to be someone I'm not, who see my background as something to overcome rather than something valuable. You wrote about looking for someone who understands that the best things require work and patience. That resonated with me. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. I was afraid you'd be someone who saw the ranch as a way to get rich quick, or who thought marrying me would be the price you'd have to pay for free land. I won't lie and say the land isn't appealing, Thomas said. But land without the right partner is just an expensive way to go broke. I've seen plenty of people inherit or buy ranches and run them into the ground because they didn't understand what they were taking on. Cindy returned to take their food orders, and Eleanor realized that she was actually hungry for the first time in days. They ordered burgers and continued talking, their conversation flowing naturally from agriculture to books to travel to family histories. Thomas had grown up in eastern Montana, the son of a mechanic and a teacher, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. Eleanor shared stories about 4 generations of Caldwells working the same land, about the weight of carrying on a family legacy in an industry that seemed designed to eliminate family operations. What's the biggest challenge you're facing with the ranch right now? Thomas asked as they waited for their food. Besides the obvious financial issues? Eleanor smiled ruefully. Honestly, it's the isolation. Ranching used to be a community effort, families helping families, shared equipment, cooperative marketing. Now everyone's struggling individually, and there's no support system for when things go wrong. That's something I've been thinking about, Thomas said. The most successful agricultural operations I've read about are the ones that find ways to collaborate instead of compete. Shared resources, complementary crops, cooperative marketing. Eleanor felt a spark of excitement. That had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with finding someone who talked about farming as a calling rather than a burden. The Hendersons to our north have been talking about selling their cattle operation because they can't afford the equipment maintenance. If we could pool resources, shared equipment, shared labor during peak seasons, maybe even shared marketing. For premium beef, Thomas continued, his enthusiasm building. It would reduce costs for everyone and create a more sustainable model. Their food arrived, but neither of them seemed particularly interested in eating as they discussed possibilities for cooperative ranching ventures, sustainable agriculture practices, and ways to make family operations viable in the modern agricultural economy. Eleanor found herself sketching diagrams on napkins, illustrating water management systems and grazing rotation, patterns that she'd been developing in her head for years, but had never had anyone to discuss them with. You know, Thomas said, pausing. Mid-bite of his burger, we've been talking for 2 hours, and I feel like I know you better than people I've dated for months. Eleanor glanced around the tavern, surprised to see that the crowd had thinned considerably while they'd been talking. I was just thinking the same thing. Usually, first meetings are all awkward small talk and trying to figure out if there's any chemistry. And is there? Thomas asked, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Chemistry, I mean. Eleanor considered the question honestly. I don't know if it's chemistry exactly, but there's something. A connection, maybe. I feel like you see me as a person rather than a problem to solve or an opportunity to exploit. You are a person, Thomas said simply. A person with ideas and dreams and knowledge that most people would overlook because they're too focused on surface things. The compliment was so straightforward, so free of the qualifying language Eleanor had learned to expect, that she felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting to seem emotional or needy. What happens now? She asked. I mean, if we decide to move forward with this arrangement, what would that look like practically? Thomas leaned back in the booth, considering. I think we'd need to spend more time together, obviously. Maybe I could come out to the ranch, meet your mother, see the operation. We'd need to talk about expectations, about how we'd structure the partnership, both personal and professional. And if we decide we're not compatible, then we shake hands and wish each other well, Thomas said. No harm done, no obligations beyond what we choose to take on. Eleanor nodded, appreciating his practical approach to what could have been an emotionally charged situation. I'd like that. The meeting at the ranch, I mean. My mother will want to meet you anyway, and you should see what you'd potentially be taking on. Tomorrow? Thomas asked. I drove over from Billings today, and I don't have to be back at work until Tuesday. Tomorrow works, Eleanor agreed, surprised by her own eagerness to continue the conversation in a more private setting. They finished their meal while discussing logistics timing, directions to the ranch, what Thomas should know about Martha Caldwell before meeting her. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor became aware again of the attention they'd been receiving throughout the evening. Several people had obviously been waiting to see how their meeting would conclude. Thomas walked Eleanor to her truck, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and genuinely considerate. The parking lot was quieter now, filled with the sounds of crickets and distant music from the tavern. Thank you for tonight, Eleanor said, her keys in her hand but no hurry to leave. This was much better than I expected. Better than I hoped for, Thomas replied. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. 2:00, Eleanor confirmed. And Thomas? Thank you for seeing me as more than just a desperate woman trying to save her ranch. Thank you for being more than that, he said simply. Eleanor drove home through the Montana darkness, her mind racing with possibilities she'd convinced herself not to consider. For the first time in months, the future felt like something other than a series of problems to solve or disasters to avoid. It felt like potential. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Montana famous, the sky stretching endlessly blue above rolling hills that seemed to pulse with hidden life. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching dust devils dance across the distant pastures while her mind replayed every moment of the previous evening. She'd slept better than she had in weeks, her dreams filled with conversations about crop rotation and water management, instead of the usual nightmares about foreclosure notices and empty bank accounts. Downstairs, Martha was already in the kitchen, her movements more animated than they'd been since before the drought began. She'd set out her best china, the delicate blue and white pattern that had belonged to Eleanor's great-grandmother, and was preparing what she called her company meal, pot roast with vegetables from the garden that had somehow survived the harsh growing conditions. "You're nervous," Eleanor observed, noting the way her mother was rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. "Of course I'm nervous," Martha replied, pausing in her fussing to look directly at her daughter. "This man could be your husband, Eleanor. He could be the father of my grandchildren. He's going to be living in this house, working this land, making decisions that affect everything we've built here." Eleanor poured herself coffee from the pot that had been brewing since dawn. "He might also be none of those things. We're still just getting to know each other. How was he last night? I mean, was he what you expected?" Eleanor considered the question while adding cream to her coffee. "He was better than I expected. Smarter, more genuine. He actually listened when I talked about the ranch, asked questions that showed he understood the complexities involved." Martha stopped her nervous arranging and focused completely on her daughter. And I think I could like him," Eleanor admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Not just tolerate him or make the best of a difficult situation, but actually like him as a person. That's more than a lot of marriages start with," Martha said quietly. "Your father and I barely knew each other when we got engaged. Our parents thought we'd be a good match, and we learned to love each other over time." Eleanor had heard fragments of her parents' story before, but never in the context of her own potential marriage to a stranger. "Do you think it worked? The arrangement, I mean?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on the tablecloth she'd been smoothing. "We had a good marriage, Eleanor. Not perfect, not always easy, but good. We respected each other, we worked toward the same goals. And eventually we found something that might have been love or might have been something better than love partnership." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a truck turning into their driveway, the engine note unfamiliar but steady. Eleanor glanced at the clock. Thomas was 15 minutes early, which she interpreted as either eagerness or anxiety. Through the kitchen window, she watched him park beside the barn and sit in his truck for a moment, probably gathering his courage for what was essentially a job interview disguised as a social call. Thomas Mitchell stepped out of his pickup wearing clean jeans, work boots that had been recently polished, and a button-down shirt that suggested respect for the occasion without pretension. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that he'd obviously picked along the roadside, a gesture that was both humble and thoughtful. Eleanor met him at the front door, noting the way his eyes took in the details of the house's exterior. The peeling paint she'd mentioned, yes, but also the solid construction, the careful maintenance of essential systems, the flower boxes that Martha kept blooming despite everything else falling apart. "You found us," Eleanor said, accepting the wildflowers with genuine pleasure. "These are beautiful." "I picked them about 10 miles back," Thomas admitted. "Seemed like the kind of thing you bring when you're meeting someone's mother for the first time." Martha appeared in the doorway behind Eleanor, her posture straight and her expression carefully neutral. She'd changed clothes 3 times before settling on a navy dress that struck the right balance between casual and formal. and Eleanor could see her making rapid assessments of their visitor. "Thomas, this is my mother, Martha Caldwell," Eleanor said. "Mom, this is Thomas Mitchell." Thomas stepped forward and offered his hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Mrs. Caldwell, thank you for inviting me to your home. Eleanor speaks of you with tremendous respect." The formal language could have sounded stilted, but Thomas delivered it with such sincerity that Martha's carefully controlled expression softened slightly. She invited him inside, leading them through the front hall into the living room where family photographs documented 4 generations of Caldwell ranchers. Thomas paused at a large, framed photograph of Eleanor's great-grandfather standing beside the original ranch house, a simple log structure that had been expanded over the decades into the current rambling homestead. "Is this the founder of the ranch?" "James Caldwell," Martha confirmed. "He homesteaded this land in 1889, built that cabin with lumber he cut himself from trees that grew along the creek." "The same creek Eleanor told me about," Thomas said, glancing at Eleanor. "The one that never runs dry." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly at this evidence that Eleanor had shared meaningful details about the ranch during their first meeting. "She took you there, did she?" "Not yet," Thomas replied. "But she described it in a way that made me understand why it's important to her." They settled into the living room, Martha in her usual chair, Eleanor and Thomas on the sofa with enough space between them to suggest respect for boundaries while still appearing comfortable together. Martha had prepared questions, Eleanor knew, a mental list of inquiries designed to determine whether Thomas Mitchell was a suitable partner for her daughter and caretaker for her family's legacy. "Eleanor tells me you grew up on a farm," Martha began, her tone conversational but her eyes sharp. "What kind of operation?" "My grandmother raised cattle and grew wheat on about 800 acres in Garfield County," Thomas replied. "Small operation by today's standards, but she ran it herself after my grandfather died, with help from neighbors during busy seasons." "What happened to it?" "She sold it to pay for medical bills when she was diagnosed with cancer," Thomas said simply. "Got a fair price, but it broke her heart to see it go to developers who turned the pastures into subdivisions." Martha nodded slowly. Ranch families understood the mathematics of medical debt, the way a single catastrophic illness could undo generations of careful financial planning. "Is that why you're interested in ranching again? To reclaim something you lost?" "Partly," Thomas admitted, "but also because I've learned that some kinds of work feed your soul in ways that other jobs don't. Construction pays well, but at the end of the day, I've built something that will probably be torn down in 20 years. Farming and ranching creates something that can last for generations if it's done right." Eleanor found herself studying Thomas's face as he spoke, noting the way his expression changed when he talked about agriculture. The careful neutrality he'd maintained since arriving was replaced by genuine passion, the same kind of intensity she felt when discussing sustainable grazing practices or soil conservation. "What's your experience with cattle?" Martha continued. "I worked with my grandmother's herd from the time I was old enough to walk," Thomas said. "Learned to identify healthy animals, assist with calving, manage grazing rotation. I'm not current on some of the newer techniques, but I understand the fundamentals." Martha asked about his financial situation, his long-term goals, his understanding of the challenges facing modern ranchers. Thomas answered each question honestly, acknowledging his limitations while demonstrating a realistic understanding of what he'd be taking on. Eleanor watched her mother's expression gradually shift from skeptical to cautiously approving. "Would you like to see the ranch?" Eleanor asked when the formal questioning seemed to be winding down. "Get a sense of what we're actually talking about?" Thomas stood immediately. "I'd love that." They walked out through the kitchen, where the pot roast filled the house with the scent of home and comfort. Martha had set the table for 3, Eleanor noted, a sign that she was at least willing to extend basic hospitality regardless of her Final assessment of their visitor. The tour began at the barn, where Eleanor showed Thomas the equipment that would need repair, the stalls that housed their remaining cattle, the hayloft that was only half full because they'd been forced to sell most of their feed. Thomas asked practical questions about machinery maintenance, veterinary costs, and seasonal workflow, demonstrating the kind of knowledge that came from experience rather than books. They walked the fence lines, checking posts and gates while Eleanor explained the pasture rotation system her father had developed, the way different areas of the ranch supported different activities throughout the year. Thomas listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or offering observations about similar systems he'd seen implemented elsewhere. At the creek, they stood on the bank where Eleanor had spent countless hours thinking and dreaming. The water ran clear and cold, cutting through limestone that had been carved smooth by centuries of patient persistence. Cottonwoods provided shade that felt like a natural cathedral, and wildflowers grew in profusion wherever the irrigation reached. "This is incredible," Thomas said, kneeling to test the water temperature. "Year-round flow like this is worth more than people realize, especially with climate change making water rights increasingly valuable. My great-grandfather chose this location specifically because of the springs," Eleanor explained. "He said water was the foundation of everything else." "Smart man." Thomas stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "What's your current water situation? Rights, allocation, restrictions?" Eleanor explained the water rights that came with the ranch, the legal protections that ensured their access even during drought years, the irrigation systems that had been upgraded over time to maximize efficiency. Thomas nodded approvingly, clearly understanding the significance of secure water in an increasingly arid region. They continued the tour through the equipment shed, the root cellar, the old bunkhouse that hadn't been used since the ranch employed seasonal workers. Thomas examined everything with the eye of someone who understood that successful ranching required attention to countless details, from the condition of machinery to the efficiency of workflows. "What would you change?" Eleanor asked as they completed the circuit back to the main house. "If this were your operation, what would be your priorities?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, obviously considering his response carefully. "Short term, I'd focus on soil improvement and pasture management. Your grazing system is sound, but some of the pastures show signs of overuse. With proper rotation and maybe some reseeding, you could increase carrying capacity without adding stress to the land." "And long-term, diversification," Thomas said without hesitation. "Cattle ranching alone is vulnerable to too many market forces. But this land could support multiple enterprises, maybe agritourism, specialty crops, even renewable energy if you lease some acreage for wind farms." Eleanor felt excitement building as Thomas outlined possibilities she'd considered, but never had the resources to pursue. He talked about farmers markets, direct-to-consumer sales, partnerships with local restaurants interested in locally sourced beef. His vision for the ranch included respect for its history while embracing innovations that could ensure its financial sustainability. They returned to the house as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. Martha had dinner ready, and they sat around the table that had hosted 4 generations of Caldwell family meals. The conversation over pot roast was easier than it had been earlier, with Martha asking about Thomas's construction work and his plans for continuing his education. "Business degree," Thomas explained when Martha asked about his online classes. "I figure if I'm going to run an agricultural operation, I need to understand the financial side as well as the practical side." "Smart thinking," Martha approved. "Too many good ranchers fail because they don't understand profit margins and cash flow." After dinner, Thomas helped clear the table despite Martha's protests that he was a guest. Eleanor found something appealing about the way he moved in their kitchen, comfortable but respectful, offering assistance without taking over. They washed dishes together while Martha prepared coffee, A domestic scene that felt surprisingly natural for people who'd known each other less than 24 hours. As evening settled over the ranch, they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The conversation had evolved from the formal interview of the afternoon to something more personal, with Martha sharing stories about Eleanor's childhood and Thomas talking about his grandmother's lessons in practical wisdom. "I should probably head back to town," Thomas said eventually, though his tone suggested reluctance rather than eagerness to leave. "It's been a long day for everyone." "Where are you staying?" Martha asked. "The motel in Millfield. I figured I'd drive back to Billings tomorrow morning." Martha and Eleanor exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that develop between people who've lived together for decades. "You could stay in the bunkhouse if you'd like," Martha offered. "Save yourself the motel fee, and maybe you could help Eleanor with some of the morning chores before you leave." Thomas looked to Eleanor for confirmation, not wanting to assume that the invitation was unanimous. She nodded, surprised by her own desire to extend their time together. "The bunkhouse is basic, but it's clean and comfortable. And I could use help moving some hay bales that are too heavy for me to handle alone." "I'd appreciate that," Thomas said. "Thank you." As they prepared to say goodnight, Eleanor walked Thomas to the bunkhouse, carrying fresh linens and towels. The building was simple but well-maintained, with a single room that contained a bed, a small table, and a window that looked out toward the creek. "Thank you for today," Thomas said as Eleanor set the linens on the bed. "Your mother is impressive, and seeing the ranch helps me understand what we'd be taking on." "What do you think?" Eleanor asked, honestly. Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out the window toward the darkening landscape. "I think it's exactly what I've been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. The land, the history, the potential, it all fits with what I want to build for the future." "And the other part of the arrangement?" Eleanor asked quietly. "The marriage part?" Thomas turned to face her directly. "I think you're exactly what I've been looking for without knowing I was looking for it too." The honesty in his voice made Eleanor's chest tighten with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "This is all happening very fast." "It is," Thomas agreed. "But sometimes the right things happen quickly and the wrong things take forever." Eleanor said goodnight and walked back to the main house, where Martha was waiting in the kitchen with obvious curiosity about how the evening had concluded. "Well?" Martha asked simply. "I think we might have found our partner," Eleanor said. The words feeling both terrifying and exactly right. Monday morning broke with the crisp promise of autumn, frost glittering on fence posts like scattered diamonds. Eleanor woke before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of ranch life, and found herself moving through her morning routine with an energy she hadn't felt in months. From her bedroom window, she could see smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, evidence that Thomas was already awake and probably preparing for the day ahead. She dressed quickly in work, clothes sturdy jeans, flannel shirt, and boots that had seen countless mornings just like this one. But as she caught her reflection in the mirror, Eleanor realized that everything felt different today. The same clothes, the same routine, the same ranch, but somehow transformed by the presence of someone who saw potential where she'd grown. Accustomed to seeing only problems. In the kitchen, Martha was already preparing breakfast for 3, her movements efficient and purposeful. The coffee was stronger than usual, and she'd set out eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, the kind of substantial meal designed to fuel a full day of physical work. "Sleep well?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she was more interested in Eleanor's thoughts than her rest. "Better than I have in weeks," Eleanor admitted, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "I'm going to take Thomas some coffee and see if he's ready for breakfast." Martha nodded approvingly. "Good. And Eleanor?" "Today is important. How he handles the work, how he interacts with the animals, how he responds to problems, all of that will tell us more about his character in any amount of conversation." Eleanor carried the steaming mug across the yard, noting how the familiar landscape seemed charged with new possibilities. The bunkhouse door was open, and she could see Thomas. Inside, fully dressed and studying what appeared to be ranch documents spread across the small table. "Good morning," she called softly. Not wanting to startle him, Thomas looked up with a smile that seemed genuine despite the early hour. "Morning. I hope you don't mind. I found these operation reports in the desk drawer and got curious about your production numbers over the past few years." Eleanor stepped inside, noting that Thomas had made the bed with military precision and had obviously spent time reviewing their ranch records. "Find anything interesting?" "Your father was a smart rancher," Thomas said, indicating the papers. "These rotation schedules from 5 years ago show he was already implementing sustainable practices that most operations are just starting to consider now. The decline in productivity isn't due to poor management. It's entirely attributable to external factors like drought and market conditions." The observation pleased Eleanor more than she'd expected. Too many people had looked at their current struggles and assumed mismanagement, but Thomas had taken the time to understand the broader context. Dad always said that good ranching was about working with natural cycles rather than fighting them. Smart man. These numbers also show that with normal rainfall and stable markets, this operation could easily support 2 families. Thomas continued, gathering the papers into neat stacks. "The foundation is solid. What's needed is capital investment and some strategic planning." They walked back to the main house together, their conversation focusing on practical matters of immediate concern. The hay bales Eleanor had mentioned needed to be moved from the field where they'd been drying to the storage area near the barn. Several fence posts along the eastern boundary required replacement before winter. The cattle needed to be rotated to fresh pasture, and the water systems needed their final winterization check. Breakfast was a working meal, with Martha, Eleanor, and Thomas discussing the day's priorities while consuming the kind of substantial food that ranch work demanded. Thomas asked detailed questions about the cattle's breeding program, the timeline for various seasonal tasks, and the coordination required with neighboring ranches for shared activities like roundups. "The Henderson place to the north," Thomas said, referencing a topic from their Saturday evening conversation. Eleanor mentioned they might be selling their cattle operation. "Have you talked to them about equipment sharing?" Martha paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Jim Henderson and I haven't spoken much since the drought started. Pride, mostly. Neither of us wanted to admit how bad things had gotten." "Maybe that's something worth revisiting," Thomas suggested diplomatically. "Especially if there are opportunities for mutual benefit." Eleanor found herself appreciating Thomas's careful approach to family dynamics he didn't fully understand. He was offering suggestions without presuming to know better than people who'd been ranching for decades, showing respect for existing relationships while identifying opportunities for improvement. After breakfast, they began the day's work with the hay bales. Thomas insisted on handling the heaviest lifting, but he also asked Eleanor to show him the most efficient methods for loading and stacking, clearly interested in learning their established systems rather than imposing his own preferences. Working alongside Thomas, Eleanor discovered that he possessed the kind of physical competence that came from years of manual labor, but also the intelligence to understand that efficiency mattered more than brute strength. He listened carefully to her explanations of their storage system, asked practical questions about moisture control and rotation schedules, and adapted quickly to their established workflows. The fence repair project revealed more about Thomas's character. When they discovered that several posts had been damaged by cattle rubbing against them, Thomas examined the underlying cause rather than simply replacing the broken wood. He identified a mineral deficiency that was causing the cattle to seek out certain plants, leading to the behavior that had damaged the fencing. "If we address the nutritional issue, we can prevent future damage," Thomas explained to Eleanor as they worked. "Might cost more upfront for mineral supplements, but it's cheaper than constantly replacing fence posts. Eleanor nodded, impressed by his systematic approach to problem solving. Dad used to say that for every problem you can see on a ranch, there are usually 3 underlying issues you can't see. Your father sounds like he understood systems thinking, Thomas replied, setting a new post with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this work many times before. Most people treat symptoms instead of causes. The morning's work progressed with the easy rhythm that develops when competent people tackle familiar tasks together. Thomas proved capable with tools, respectful of the animals, and attentive to safety considerations that mattered in ranch work. More importantly, he demonstrated the kind of patience that successful ranching required, never rushing through tasks that needed to be done properly. Around mid-morning, they were interrupted by the arrival of a pickup truck that Eleanor didn't immediately recognize. A vehicle parked near the barn, and a man in expensive suit emerged, carrying a briefcase and looking distinctly out of place in the ranch environment. "Mrs. Caldwell?" the man called, approaching Eleanor with the kind of confidence that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "My name is Robert Henley. I called last week about your marriage proposal." Eleanor felt her stomach drop as she recognized the name. This was the man Martha had described as sounding calculating, the one who'd asked detailed questions about financial records and property surveys. In person, he appeared to be exactly what Eleanor had feared, someone who saw the ranch as a business opportunity rather than a way of life. "Mr. Henley," Eleanor replied carefully, "I wasn't expecting you. I was in the area and thought I'd take a look at the property," Henley said, his eyes already scanning the buildings and pastures with obvious assessment. "I've done some research on comparable sales in the region, and I think we could work out a mutually beneficial arrangement." Thomas had stopped working and was observing the interaction with obvious interest, though he hadn't moved closer or inserted himself into the conversation. Eleanor appreciated his restraint, recognizing that this was her situation to handle. "I appreciate your interest," Eleanor said diplomatically, "but I should mention that I'm currently exploring other options." Henley's eyes shifted to Thomas, taking in his work clothes and the tools in his hands. "I see. Well, I hope you'll consider all possibilities before making any final decisions. I can offer immediate financial relief for your current difficulties, plus a comprehensive development plan that would maximize the property's potential." "What kind of development?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "Subdivision mostly. This land is perfectly positioned for residential development, especially with the growing interest in rural lifestyle properties. We could easily get approval for 50 to 75 home sites, maybe more with creative planning." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And the ranching operation?" Henley shrugged dismissively. "Cattle ranching isn't economically viable in this region anymore. The highest and best use for this land is clearly residential development. You'd make more money in 5 years than your family has made in 50 years of ranching." Thomas had moved closer during this exchange, not threateningly, but with obvious interest in the conversation. Eleanor could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands had clenched slightly at Henley's casual dismissal of agricultural use. "Mr. Henley," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This ranch isn't for sale for development purposes. The arrangement I'm considering is specifically designed to preserve the agricultural operation and the family legacy." "But surely you understand the financial realities," Henley pressed. "Sentiment doesn't pay bills, Miss Caldwell. I'm offering you a chance to secure your financial future instead of clinging to an outdated way of life." Thomas stepped forward then, his movement casual but deliberate. "Excuse me," he said to Henley, his tone polite but firm. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Thomas Mitchell." Henley looked at Thomas with obvious dismissal, clearly categorizing him as hired help rather than a serious participant in any business discussion. Robert Henley, Henley Development Corporation. And you are? Eleanor's partner, Thomas said simply, the words carrying implications that made Eleanor's heart skip slightly. Henley's expression shifted as he reassessed the situation, clearly realizing that Thomas represented competition for his development plans. I see. Well, Mr. Mitchell, I hope you understand the financial realities of modern agriculture. Ranching operations like this one are essentially charitable endeavors at this point. Actually, Thomas replied, his voice remaining calm, I think you might be underestimating both the financial potential of sustainable agriculture and the intrinsic value of maintaining working landscapes, but I appreciate your perspective. The polite dismissal was expertly delivered, and Eleanor found herself admiring Thomas's ability to remain courteous while clearly establishing boundaries. Henley seemed to recognize that he was facing more sophisticated opposition than he'd expected. Well, Henley said, addressing Eleanor directly, I hope you'll keep my offer in mind. Development opportunities like this don't come along often, and market conditions won't stay favorable forever. He handed Eleanor a business card and returned to his truck, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence and the distinct feeling that this wouldn't be his final attempt to acquire the property. Charming fellow, Thomas said dryly once Henley had driven away. Eleanor looked down at the business card, noting the impressive list of credentials and the Denver address. He's probably right about the money. A development deal would solve all our financial problems permanently. And destroy everything your family built, Thomas observed. Sometimes the most expensive choice is the one that costs you your soul. The comment surprised Eleanor with its insight into her internal conflict. She'd been so focused on the mathematical aspects of their situation that she'd almost forgotten the emotional and cultural costs of different solutions. Martha appeared from the house, obviously having watched the encounter from the kitchen window. What did that man want? She asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected. To turn the ranch into a subdivision, Eleanor replied, handing her mother the business card. Martha examined the card with obvious distaste. 70 years. I've lived on this land, and that man thinks 5 minutes of looking around qualifies him to determine its highest and best use. He's not wrong about the money, Eleanor said quietly. We could be financially secure for the rest of our lives. And what would we do with that security? Martha asked pointedly. Move to town? Buy a condo? Spend our days wondering what happened to everything we used to care about. Thomas had returned to work on the fence posts, giving them space for what was clearly a family discussion, but Eleanor could see him listening with obvious interest. Maybe it's time to consider whether holding on to the past is worth sacrificing the future, Eleanor said, voicing doubts she'd been suppressing. Or maybe, Thomas called from where he was working, it's time to consider whether the past and the future don't have to be mutually exclusive. Both women looked toward him, surprised by his interjection into what they'd assumed was a private conversation. Sorry, Thomas said, straightening up from his work, but I've been thinking about something all morning. What if the choice isn't between selling to developers or struggling to maintain a traditional ranching operation? What if there's a third option that honors the land's history while embracing its potential? Eleanor felt something shift in her thinking, a recognition that she'd been trapped in binary thinking when more creative solutions might exist. What kind of third option? Martha asked. Thomas set down his tools and walked toward them, his expression thoughtful. Agritourism, educational programs, sustainable agriculture demonstrations, direct marketing of premium beef, renewable energy partnerships. There are dozens of ways to generate revenue from ranchland without abandoning its agricultural purpose. He paused, looking across the landscape with obvious appreciation. This place has something that can't be subdivided or developed authenticity. In a world where everything is becoming increasingly artificial, there's tremendous value in preserving real working landscapes. Eleanor found herself caught between hope and skepticism. Those things all require capital investment, marketing expertise, and business planning. We're barely keeping the basic operation afloat. Which is why partnership makes sense, Thomas replied. I bring construction skills, business education, and fresh energy. You bring knowledge, experience, and established relationships. Together, we might be able to build something that neither of us could create alone. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching, but this time Eleanor recognized the truck immediately. Jim Henderson from the neighboring ranch was driving slowly up their driveway, his presence as unexpected as it was welcome. Henderson parked near the barn and emerged slowly, his movements showing the effects of 70-plus years of ranch work. He nodded politely to Thomas before addressing Eleanor and Martha directly. Heard you folks might be looking for some cooperative arrangements, Henderson said without preamble. Thought it might be time we talked about some mutual solutions to mutual problems. Eleanor glanced at Thomas, wondering if he'd somehow contacted Henderson, but his expression suggested he was as surprised as she was by the timing of this visit. What kind of cooperative arrangements? Martha asked, her tone cautious but interested. Henderson adjusted his hat, a gesture Eleanor recognized as his way of buying time to organize his thoughts. Well, I've got equipment I can't afford to maintain, and not enough work to justify. You've got work that needs doing, and not enough equipment to do it efficiently. Seems like there might be some room for discussion. As the four of them stood in the ranch yard, surrounded by the landscape that represented 4 generations of Caldwell family history, Eleanor realized that the choices she'd thought were so clear-cut were actually far more complex and far more hopeful than she'd imagined. The conversation with Jim Henderson moved to the kitchen table, where Martha served coffee while the 4 adults spread out papers that documented decades of neighboring ranch operations. Henderson had brought his equipment inventory, maintenance schedules, and seasonal workflow charts documents that told the story of a man who'd spent his entire adult life trying to make small-scale ranching economically viable. Here's what I'm thinking, Henderson said, pointing to a hand-drawn map that showed both properties. I've got a hay baler that sits idle 10 months out of the year, a cattle trailer that gets used maybe twice, and irrigation equipment that's too expensive for either of us to replace when it breaks down. Thomas studied the map with obvious interest, asking questions about soil types, water availability, and seasonal patterns that demonstrated his growing understanding of the regional agricultural challenges. Eleanor found herself watching the interplay between the 3 men, noting how Henderson had unconsciously begun directing his comments toward Thomas as much as toward her and Martha. What about shared marketing? Thomas asked. If both operations are producing grass-fed beef, there might be opportunities to develop a regional brand, maybe target restaurants or farmers markets that value locally sourced products. Henderson's weathered face lit up with interest. That's exactly what I've been thinking. Sarah, that's my daughter, she's been after me to start direct-to-consumer sales, but I don't have the volume to make it worthwhile. Combined operations might be different. Eleanor felt excitement building as the conversation evolved from simple equipment sharing to comprehensive business planning. These were the kinds of innovative approaches she dreamed about, but never had the resources or partners to implement. Thomas was asking the right questions, Henderson was providing decades of practical experience, and together they were sketching out possibilities that none of them could have achieved individually. What about the Henderson place? Martha asked. Are you planning to keep the ranch in operation? Henderson's expression grew more serious. That depends on whether I can make it financially sustainable. My arthritis isn't getting any better, and Sarah's got her own life in Billings. If I can't find a way to make the numbers work, I'll probably have to sell within the next few years. The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Henderson represented exactly the kind of generational transition that was eliminating family ranches throughout the region, aging operators with no successors, forced to choose between selling to developers or watching their life's work deteriorate from neglect. What if there were other options? Thomas asked carefully. Something between selling out and struggling alone? Henderson looked at him with the kind of sharp attention that suggested he was ready to consider proposals he might have dismissed. From someone with less obvious agricultural knowledge. What kind of options? Thomas glanced at Eleanor, clearly seeking permission before outlining ideas that would affect her family's future. She nodded encouragingly, recognizing that his outside perspective might identify solutions that had escaped people too close to the problems. Cooperative ownership, Thomas said. Pool resources, share risks, create economies of scale that make individual operations more viable. You maintain ownership of your land, we maintain ownership of ours, but we operate as a single business entity for purposes of equipment, marketing, and labor. The concept wasn't entirely new. Eleanor had read about similar arrangements in agricultural journals, but hearing it proposed as a practical solution to their specific situation made it feel suddenly achievable. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, obviously considering the implications. That would require a lot of trust, he said finally, and some complicated legal arrangements. Most worthwhile things do, Martha observed, but it might be better than the alternatives. They spent the next 2 hours discussing practical details: how shared expenses would be calculated, how decisions would be made, how profits would be distributed. Thomas proved surprisingly knowledgeable about cooperative business structures, referencing case studies from other agricultural regions where similar arrangements had succeeded. By noon, they had outlined a preliminary agreement that addressed immediate needs while providing a framework for long-term collaboration. Henderson would contribute equipment and expertise. The Caldwells would provide land and facilities, and Thomas would bring capital investment and business planning skills. Most importantly, they would work together to develop new revenue streams that could support both families. I'll need to talk this over with Sarah, Henderson said as he prepared to leave. And you folks will need time to consider whether this is really what you want. But I have to say, it's the first conversation about the future that's made me feel hopeful in quite a while. After Henderson departed, Eleanor, Martha, and Thomas returned to the porch where they could process the morning's developments in private. The cooperative arrangement offered exactly the kind of creative solution that Thomas had suggested might exist, but it also represented a significant commitment that would bind their futures together in ways that went far beyond the original marriage proposal. What do you think? Eleanor asked Thomas, noting how naturally she'd begun seeking his opinion on major decisions. I think it could work, Thomas replied thoughtfully. Henderson knows the local market. He has established relationships with suppliers and buyers, and his equipment inventory complements what you already have here. The cooperative structure would provide financial stability while preserving the agricultural character of both properties. Martha rocked gently in her chair, her expression thoughtful. It would also mean that whatever happens between you two personally, you'd be business partners with our neighbor for the foreseeable future. That's a lot of complexity to add to an already complicated situation. The observation highlighted tensions that Eleanor had been trying not to think about. Their arrangement had begun as a straightforward transaction marriage, in exchange for land, but it was evolving into something much more intricate. Business partnerships, cooperative agreements, shared financial obligations, and personal relationships were becoming increasingly intertwined in ways that made simple solutions impossible. Maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, Thomas said. Quietly, successful ranching has always been about community relationships, shared resources, mutual support. What we're talking about is really just formalizing arrangements that used to happen naturally. Eleanor found herself studying Thomas's profile as he spoke, noting the way he seemed to understand not just the practical aspects of their situation, but also its emotional and cultural dimensions. He was talking about building something sustainable, something that honored the past while embracing the future. There's something else we need to discuss, Eleanor said, her voice carrying a weight that made both Thomas and Martha look at her directly. Robert Henley isn't going to give up easily. Development pressure in this region is only going to increase, and our financial situation makes us vulnerable to the kind of offers that are hard to refuse. Thomas nodded grimly. I got that impression. He strikes me as someone who's accustomed to getting what he wants, and he's probably got the resources to be very persuasive. Which is why we need to make sure our alternative plan is solid, Martha said. If we're going to resist development pressure, we need to prove that agricultural use can be financially viable. The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's phone. Ringing, the caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. Eleanor, this is Sarah Henderson, Jim's daughter. Dad just called me about your meeting this morning, and I wanted to talk to you about something. Eleanor put the call on speaker so that Martha and Thomas could participate in the conversation. Sarah Henderson worked as an agricultural loan officer at a bank in Billings, which gave her unique insight into the financial challenges facing ranch operations throughout the region. I've been watching what's happening to family ranches, Sarah continued, and I've been thinking about ways to help good operations survive the transition to new economic realities. What you and Dad discussed this morning, the cooperative approach, it's exactly the kind of innovative thinking that could make a real difference. Sarah went on to explain that her bank had been developing loan programs specifically designed to support agricultural cooperatives, recognizing that traditional individual ranch loans were becoming increasingly difficult to justify given market conditions. If you're serious about this partnership, Sarah said, I might be able to help with financing for equipment upgrades, facility improvements, even working capital for the first few years while you're developing new revenue streams. Eleanor felt hope and anxiety in equal measure. Access to capital would solve many of their immediate problems, but it would also commit them to a path that would be difficult to reverse. What kind of timeline are we talking about? Thomas asked. If you can provide business plans and financial projections, I could have preliminary loan approval within 2 weeks, Sarah replied. The bank is eager to support projects that preserve agricultural land use while demonstrating economic viability. After the call ended, the three of them sat in thoughtful silence, each contemplating the implications of moving forward with an arrangement that had grown far beyond their original expectations. It's a lot, Eleanor said finally. It is, Thomas. Agreed. But it's also exactly what we've been talking about, a way to preserve what matters while building something sustainable for the future. Martha stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the landscape that had defined her family's identity for 4 generations. Your great-great-grandfather would have understood this, she said to Eleanor. He didn't homestead this land because it was easy. He chose it because he could see its potential, and he was willing to work for something bigger than immediate profit. Eleanor joined her mother at the railing, following her gaze across pastures that seemed to shimmer with possibility in the afternoon light. Are we crazy to think we can make this work? Probably, Martha replied with a slight smile. But the best decisions usually feel a little crazy at first. Thomas approached them at the railing, his presence adding weight to their small group. There's one more thing we should discuss, he said carefully. The personal side of this arrangement. If we're going to be business partners with Henderson, if we're taking on debt obligations, if we're building something that's intended to last for decades, we need to be clear about what we're committing to with each other. Eleanor felt her heart rate increase as Thomas articulated questions she'd been avoiding. Their relationship had evolved rapidly from a desperate business arrangement to something that felt increasingly like genuine partnership, but they'd never explicitly discussed the emotional dimensions of their potential marriage. What are you asking? Eleanor said, though she suspected she knew. I'm asking whether this is still just a transaction for you, or whether it's becoming something more, Thomas replied honestly. Because it's becoming something more for me, and I think we owe it to each other to be honest about where we stand. Martha excused herself diplomatically, claiming she needed to start dinner preparations, leaving Eleanor and Thomas alone on the porch with a conversation that would determine not just their business relationship but their personal future. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering how to articulate feelings that she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. 3 days ago, I thought I was advertising for a business partner who would tolerate marriage as part of the deal, she said finally. Now I'm thinking about what it would be like to build a life with someone who sees the same possibilities. I see, who understands why this land matters, who makes me feel like I could be more than I thought possible. Thomas moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. And how do you feel about that? Terrified, Eleanor admitted with a laugh that held more hope than fear. But also more excited about the future than I've been in years. Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that felt both tentative and certain. I came here looking for land and found something I didn't know I was missing. You're not just someone I'd tolerate marrying, you're someone I'd choose to marry even if there wasn't a ranch involved. The honesty of his words made Eleanor's chest tighten with emotions she'd convinced herself she'd never experience. So what do we do now? Now we decide whether we're brave enough to try building something extraordinary together, Thomas said simply. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eleanor realized that her carefully controlled life was about to become something entirely unpredictable. The marriage proposal that had begun as desperate necessity was transforming into genuine possibility, and for the first time in her adult life, she was ready to choose hope over safety. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the county courthouse wearing the same forest green dress she'd worn to Murphy's Tavern, but this time it was accessorized with her grandmother's pearl necklace and a sense of certainty that surprised her with its strength. Thomas waited beside her in a navy suit that transformed his rugged handsomeness into something more formal, but no less appealing, his hands steady as he held the marriage license that would legally bind their futures together. The decision to marry had crystallized during a week of intensive business planning, as they'd worked with Sarah Henderson to develop loan applications and cooperative agreements that required legal spousal status to qualify for the most favorable terms. What had begun as romantic possibility had been accelerated by financial necessity, but Eleanor found herself remarkably at peace with the compressed timeline. Judge Patricia Morley, a woman in her 60s who'd been officiating weddings in Millfield County for over 20 years, had agreed to perform the ceremony in her chambers rather than requiring them to wait for a formal court date. She possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from witnessing hundreds of marriages, and her approach to the ceremony reflected an understanding that not all unions began with traditional romance. Marriage, Judge Morley began, addressing Eleanor and Thomas directly, is fundamentally about partnership. It's about two people choosing to build something together that neither could create alone. Whether that something is a family, a business, a way of life, or simply a commitment to face whatever comes next as a team, the choice to unite your lives legally represents faith in your ability to work together toward common goals. Martha sat in the front row of chairs, wearing her best dress and a carefully controlled expression that Eleanor recognized as her mother's way of managing complicated emotions. Jim Henderson occupied the chair beside her, having insisted on serving as witness to what he called the most sensible wedding arrangement he'd seen in decades. Sarah Henderson had driven over from Billings to serve as the second witness, bringing with her the final loan documents that would fund their cooperative venture. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with Judge Morley guiding them through vows that emphasized partnership, mutual respect, and shared commitment to the land they would steward together. When Thomas placed the simple gold band on Eleanor's finger, a ring they'd selected together from the jewelry store in Millfield, just 3 days earlier, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of her own identity. Eleanor Caldwell was becoming Eleanor Mitchell, not through some fairy tale romance, but through a carefully considered decision to join her life with someone who saw her as an equal partner in building something worthwhile. The pragmatic foundation of their relationship felt more solid than the emotional turbulence she'd observed in friends' marriages that had begun with passion but lacked practical compatibility. "You may kiss the bride," Judge Morley announced with a smile that suggested she found genuine pleasure in their unconventional love story. Thomas's kiss was gentle but confident, a promise rather than a performance, and Eleanor felt herself responding with a warmth that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine affection for the man who'd chosen to tie his future to hers. The small reception that followed took place at Murphy's Tavern, where they'd first met just 3 weeks earlier. Word of the wedding had spread through Millfield with typical small-town efficiency, and the tavern was crowded with neighbors, business associates, and curiosity seekers who wanted to witness the conclusion of what had become local legend. Eleanor found herself moving through conversations with a confidence she'd never possessed at social gatherings, Thomas's presence beside her providing a kind of social anchor that allowed her to engage with people as half of a partnership rather than as a single woman subject to evaluation and pity. Several ranchers approached them with congratulations that seemed genuinely warm, and Eleanor realized that their marriage was being interpreted by the agricultural community as a smart business decision rather than a desperate last resort. "You know," said Pete Morrison, the old man who'd witnessed Martha posting the original notice, "this might be the smartest thing anyone's done in this county in years. Combining operations, sharing resources, bringing in fresh energy, that's how family ranches are going to survive." The comment was echoed throughout the evening by people who understood the economics of modern agriculture and appreciated innovative approaches to traditional challenges. Eleanor began to see their marriage through the eyes of their community, not as a romantic compromise, but as a practical solution that honored both business sense and family legacy. Thomas proved surprisingly comfortable in social situations, engaging easily with ranchers who wanted to discuss cattle breeding, with local business owners interested in direct marketing opportunities, and with older residents who remembered his grandmother and wanted to share stories about the regional agricultural history that connected their families. "He fits," Martha observed to Eleanor during a quiet moment when Thomas was deep in conversation with Jim Henderson about equipment maintenance schedules. "I wasn't sure he would, coming from outside the community, but he understands how things work here." Eleanor watched her new husband. The phrase still felt strange but increasingly right as he listened intently to Henderson's explanation of seasonal workflow patterns. Thomas had the gift of making people feel heard, of asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite attention. "I think he fits because he wants to fit," Eleanor replied. "He's not trying to change everything to suit his preferences. He's trying to understand how to work within existing systems while making them better." The evening concluded with an impromptu toast from Jim Henderson, who stood at their table and raised his beer with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for more formal occasions. "To Eleanor and Thomas," Henderson said, his voice carrying across the crowded tavern, "for proving that the best partnerships are built on shared vision, mutual respect, and the courage to try something new. May your marriage be as successful as your business plan." The toast was met with laughter and applause from a crowd that had come to regard their union as a victory for practical thinking over romantic idealism. Eleanor found herself genuinely moved by the community's support, realizing that she'd never felt more accepted or valued than she did in this moment of public recognition for her choices. Later that evening, back at the ranch that was now legally as much Thomas's as it was hers, Eleanor faced the practical reality of sharing living space with someone who had been a stranger just 3 weeks earlier. They'd discussed sleeping arrangements with the kind of frank practicality that characterized most of their interactions, deciding that Thomas would move into the master bedroom that had belonged to Eleanor's parents, while Eleanor would remain in her childhood room until they felt comfortable with more intimate arrangements. The decision reflected their mutual recognition that physical intimacy would develop at its own pace, separate from the legal and financial aspects of their marriage. Both of them had experienced relationships that had prioritized passion over compatibility, and both were committed to building something more substantial than mere attraction. Thomas had spent the day moving his possessions from the bunkhouse to the main house, a process that highlighted how few material belongings he'd accumulated during his years in Billings. His clothes fit easily into half of the master bedroom closet. His books filled 2 shelves of the bookcase, and his personal items occupied a small portion of the dresser surface. "I travel light," Thomas explained when Eleanor commented on the efficiency of his packing. "Learned that from moving around after the divorce. Amazing how little you actually need when you focus on essentials." Eleanor found his minimalism refreshing. After years of accumulating possessions that had more to do with filling emotional voids than serving practical purposes, Thomas's belongings seemed carefully chosen quality tools, well-worn books, photographs that clearly meant something to him, and very little that appeared to be decorative rather than functional. They spent their wedding night in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reviewing the loan documents that Sarah Henderson had delivered earlier that day. The paperwork represented approval for enough capital to fund equipment purchases, facility improvements, and operating expenses for their first year of cooperative operation with Jim Henderson. "This is really happening," Eleanor said, signing documents that committed them to debt levels that would have terrified her just a month earlier. "In 6 months, we'll be running a completely different kind of operation." Thomas reviewed the loan terms with the kind of careful attention that suggested he understood both the opportunities and the risks they were accepting. "The numbers work," he said finally. "If we can achieve the production targets we've projected, and if the direct marketing initiatives generate the revenue we're expecting, we'll be profitable within 2 years. And if we can't, then we'll figure out Plan B," Thomas replied with a confidence that Eleanor found both reassuring and slightly reckless. "But I think we can. The market research Sarah provided shows real demand for locally sourced, sustainably raised beef. We've got the land, the water, the expertise, and now the capital. Most importantly, we've got partners who understand what we're trying to build." Eleanor signed the final document and set down her pen, officially committing them to a future that bore no resemblance to the life she'd been living just a month earlier. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, weeks of careful planning compressed into a single moment of irreversible decision. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Tomorrow they would begin the practical work of merging operations with Henderson, implementing the business plan they'd developed, and learning to live together as partners in every sense of the word. "Tomorrow we start building what we've been planning," Thomas said simply. "And we figure out what marriage looks like when it's based on partnership instead of romance." Eleanor considered the unconventional foundation of their relationship, recognizing that they were creating something that didn't fit traditional categories. Their marriage was simultaneously practical and emotional, calculated and spontaneous, cautious and bold. "Do you think it will work?" she asked, the question encompassing both their business venture and their personal relationship. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he gave to all important matters. "I think we have better odds than most marriages," he said finally. "We've gone into this with realistic expectations, shared goals, and genuine respect for each other. We're not expecting each other to be someone we're not, and we're not trying to build something based on fantasy." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his practical approach to what could have been an emotionally charged conversation. "Plus, we're already better at working together than most couples I know." "There's that," Thomas agreed with a smile. "Though I suspect we'll discover new challenges as we go along." They cleaned up the kitchen together with the easy efficiency that had developed during their weeks of working side by side, each anticipating the other's movements in a way that suggested genuine compatibility. As they prepared to retreat to their separate bedrooms, Eleanor felt a moment of awkwardness about the sleeping arrangements they'd negotiated. "Thomas," she said as they paused at the top of the stairs, "thank you for all of this. For seeing possibilities instead of problems, for being willing to take a chance on someone you barely knew, for treating me like a partner instead of a convenience." Thomas moved closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes that had become increasingly familiar over their weeks of working together. "Thank you for taking a chance on," he said quietly, "and for trusting me with something as important as your family's legacy." He kissed her goodnight with the same gentle confidence he'd shown during the ceremony, a gesture that felt both husbandly and respectful of the boundaries they'd established. Eleanor went to bed that night as a married woman for the first time in her life, but more importantly, she went to bed as someone who had chosen to bet her future on partnership, cooperation, and the radical idea that practical love might be more sustainable than passionate romance. Outside her window, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly under stars that had witnessed 4 generations of Caldwell dreams and struggles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the practical work of building something that honored the past while embracing the future. For the first time in years, Eleanor fell asleep looking forward to whatever came next. 6 months after their wedding, Eleanor Mitchell stood in the newly constructed farm store that occupied the renovated barn's ground floor, arranging packages of grass-fed beef in the refrigerated display case while customers browsed locally made preserves, fresh vegetables, and educational materials about sustainable agriculture. The transformation of their operation had exceeded even Thomas's optimistic projections, with direct-to-consumer sales generating revenue streams that traditional cattle ranching alone could never have achieved. The farm store had been Thomas's brainchild, but Eleanor had designed the layout and managed the relationships with local suppliers, who now used their facility as a cooperative marketing center. What had begun as a simple plan to sell their own beef had evolved into a regional hub for sustainable agriculture, drawing customers from as far away as Billings who valued the transparency and quality that came with knowing exactly where their food was produced. "Mrs. Mitchell," called Jenny Patterson, a regular customer who drove out from town every Saturday morning, "do you have any of those lamb chops from the Henderson place? My husband has been asking about them all week." Eleanor smiled at the easy way people had accepted her married name, though she still felt a small thrill of pride whenever someone addressed her as Mrs. Mitchell. The title represented more than just legal status. It symbolized her transformation from the desperate woman who'd posted a marriage notice to someone who was recognized as half of a successful business partnership. "We just got a fresh delivery yesterday," Eleanor replied, moving to the freezer section where Henderson's lamb products occupied prime real estate. "Jim's been experimenting with new cuts, and these chops are from his spring lambs." The cooperative arrangement with Henderson had proven even more successful than their most optimistic projections. Shared equipment had reduced operating costs for both ranches by nearly 40%, while joint marketing efforts had created a brand identity, Three Rivers Ranch Cooperative, that commanded premium prices from consumers who valued sustainable, locally produced meat. Thomas emerged from the back office where he'd been reviewing quarterly financial reports with Sarah Henderson, who now served as their business advisor in addition to managing their loan portfolio. His work clothes had given way to a combination of ranch wear and business casual that reflected his dual roles as working rancher and business manager. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Thomas said, his easy familiarity with their customers demonstrating how completely he'd integrated into the local community. "Did Eleanor tell you about the farm tour we're offering next weekend? Perfect timing if you're interested in seeing how our rotational grazing system works." The agritourism component of their business had become unexpectedly popular with urban families driving considerable distances to experience authentic ranch life while learning about sustainable agriculture. Thomas had designed educational programs that appealed to both children and adults, creating another revenue stream while building community support for agricultural preservation. Eleanor watched Thomas interact with customers, noting how naturally he'd assumed the role of educator and ambassador for their operation. His construction background had proven invaluable for facility improvements, but his real gift was his ability to communicate complex agricultural concepts in ways that made farming accessible to people with no rural experience. Sarah Henderson appeared from the office, carrying financial reports that represented 6 months of careful business development. At 28, she possessed the kind of analytical intelligence that made her invaluable to agricultural operations trying to navigate modern economic realities while maintaining traditional values. "The numbers look excellent," Sarah announced to Eleanor and Thomas. "You're ahead of projections in every category, and the loan payments are well within manageable parameters. More importantly, you're building equity at a rate that puts you on track for complete debt payoff within 7 years." The financial security represented by those numbers would have seemed impossible just a year earlier, when Eleanor had been facing foreclosure and considering marriage to a stranger as her only option. Now she was part of a thriving operation that supported 3 families while demonstrating that innovative approaches to agriculture could be both profitable and sustainable. "What about expansion possibilities?" Thomas asked, his question reflecting conversations they'd been having about adding value-added products to their inventory. "The cash flow projections support modest expansion," Sarah replied. "If you're serious about adding a commercial kitchen for processed products, the numbers work. You could probably handle the additional debt service within 18 months. Eleanor felt a familiar excitement building as they discussed possibilities for artisanal sausages, jerky products, and prepared meals that would allow them to capture more value from their livestock while providing convenient options for busy customers. Each new venture represented not just additional income, but also deeper integration into the regional food system. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Robert Henley, the developer who tried to purchase their ranch for subdivision development, entered the farm store with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he wasn't there for grass-fed beef. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," Henley said, his tone professionally cordial, but his eyes calculating as they surveyed the transformed barn interior. "Impressive operation you've built here." Eleanor felt Thomas move slightly closer to her, a subtle gesture of solidarity that she appreciated, even though she no longer felt intimidated by Henley's presence. Their success had given her confidence that came from knowing they'd built something valuable through their own efforts rather than simply inherited it. "Mr. Henley," Eleanor replied neutrally, "what brings you out here today?" "I wanted to congratulate you on your success," Henley said, though his tone suggested the congratulations were purely perfunctory, "and to make you aware of some developments that might affect your long-term planning." Thomas crossed his arms, his posture suggesting patience, but not welcome for whatever sales pitch Henley was preparing to deliver. "What kind of developments?" "The county is considering zoning changes that would allow higher density residential development throughout this region," Henley explained. "Property values are going to increase substantially over the next few years, which creates interesting opportunities for landowners who are willing to think strategically about their assets." Eleanor understood immediately what Henley was suggesting. Even their successful agricultural operation wouldn't generate the kind of immediate wealth that land development could provide, and he was betting that financial temptation would eventually overcome their commitment to farming. "And you're here to help us think strategically?" Thomas asked, his tone carrying just enough edge to suggest he found Henley's approach presumptuous. "I'm here to make sure you understand all your options," Henley replied smoothly. Agricultural operations are wonderful for lifestyle purposes, but they're not optimal investments from a pure financial perspective. With development rights, this property could generate enough capital to fund any agricultural operation you wanted to pursue elsewhere. Sarah Henderson had been listening to the conversation with obvious interest, and she stepped forward with the kind of professional authority that came from understanding both agricultural finance and regional development pressures. "Mr. Henley," Sarah said, "I think you might be underestimating both the profitability of well-managed agricultural operations and the long-term value of preserving working landscapes in regions facing development pressure." Henley turned his attention to Sarah, clearly recognizing her as someone with relevant expertise. "I'm sure your operations are profitable, but development returns are substantially higher than agricultural returns. We're talking about generational wealth creation. And we're talking about generational land stewardship," Eleanor interjected, her voice carrying a conviction that had grown stronger over months of proving that agriculture could be both profitable and meaningful. "Some things are worth more than their immediate financial value." Thomas nodded in agreement. "We've built something here that supports 3 families, serves our community, and preserves agricultural land for future generations. That seems like a better definition of generational wealth than turning productive farmland into suburban sprawl." Henley clearly recognized that he was facing more sophisticated opposition than he'd encountered during his first visit. Their success had given them not just financial stability, but also the confidence to reject proposals that didn't align with their values. "I respect your commitment to agriculture," Henley said, his tone suggesting he found their position admirable, but ultimately naive. "But I encourage you to keep open minds about future opportunities. Development pressure in this region is only going to increase." After Henley departed, the 3 of them stood in thoughtful silence, processing the implications of his visit. The success of their operation had made them less vulnerable to financial pressure, but it had also made their property more valuable to developers who saw agricultural land as raw material for residential projects. "He's not wrong about development pressure," Sarah observed. "Several ranches in the county have sold to developers over the past year, and the trend is accelerating." "Which makes what we're doing here even more important," Thomas replied. "Every successful agricultural operation that resists development pressure helps preserve the rural character of the region." Eleanor nodded, feeling renewed commitment to their mission of proving that family-scale agriculture could thrive in the modern economy. Their success story was being watched by other ranching families who were facing similar pressures, and their example could influence decisions that would shape the region's future for decades. The rest of the day proceeded with the comfortable rhythm that had developed over months of working together. Eleanor managed customer interactions and inventory. Thomas handled facility maintenance and educational programs, and both of them shared responsibility for the livestock care that remained the foundation of their operation. As evening approached, they closed the farm store and walked the fence lines together, a daily ritual that served both practical and personal purposes. The physical work of checking cattle, testing water systems, and monitoring pasture conditions provided opportunities for conversation that had gradually evolved from business planning to genuine intimacy. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't responded to your notice?" Thomas asked as they paused beside the creek where Eleanor had spent so many hours contemplating her future before he'd entered her life. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I think I would have found some way to save the ranch," she said finally. "Maybe not as successfully as this, but I wouldn't have given up." "And the marriage part? Do you think you would have ended up with someone else?" The question touched on territory they rarely discussed, the romantic roads not taken, the possibility that their practical partnership might have prevented them from finding more passionate connections with other people. "I don't think I would have married anyone else," Eleanor admitted. Before you, I'd convinced myself that marriage wasn't something I should expect. I thought I was too fat, too shy, too set in my ways to be someone's first choice. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her directly. And now? Eleanor met his gaze with the confidence that had grown gradually over months of being valued as an equal partner in every aspect of their shared life. Now I know that I was waiting for someone who would choose me for who I am rather than despite who I am. The distinction was important, representing a fundamental difference between settling for acceptance and being genuinely valued. Thomas had never treated her size as something to overlook or overcome. He simply saw her as Eleanor, complete and worthy of respect exactly as she was. "I love you," Thomas said simply, the words carrying weight because they'd never been spoken. Casually or strategically. Not because you came with a ranch, not because you're convenient, but because you're exactly the person I want to build a life with. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, emotions that had nothing to do with desperation or gratitude and everything to do with the profound satisfaction of being truly known by someone who chose to stay. "I love you too," she replied. "More than I thought possible when we started this arrangement." They kissed beside the creek where Eleanor had once sat alone, contemplating a future that had seemed increasingly limited. Now that same creek reflected evening light that illuminated possibilities she'd never dared to imagine: a successful business, a strong marriage, and a legacy that honored the past while embracing innovation. As they walked back toward the house, where Martha was preparing dinner for the three of them, Eleanor reflected on the transformation that had begun with a desperate notice posted on a general store bulletin board. What had started as a last resort had become the foundation for something extraordinary, a partnership that had saved not just her family's ranch, but her own sense of what was possible. The ranch that had nearly been lost to debt and despair was now a thriving operation that supported multiple families while demonstrating sustainable approaches to agriculture. More importantly, the woman who had once considered herself unmarriageable had found not just a husband, but a true partner, who saw her potential and helped her build something remarkable. 6 months after posting a marriage proposal that had seemed like an act of desperation, Eleanor Mitchell stood on land that would remain in agricultural use for generations to come, surrounded by evidence that practical love could grow into something deeper and more sustainable than any romance that began with passion alone. The widow's offer of her ranch to any man who'd marry her fat daughter had resulted in a partnership that exceeded everyone's expectations, proving that sometimes the most unconventional beginnings lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.